You might wonder how a man like me, calm, deliberate, and calculated, finds himself at the crossroads of betrayal and violence. But life isn't a straight line, is it? It twists, turns, and sometimes slams you into walls you never saw coming. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the first crack in the foundation of my marriage, and how I ended up face to face with the man who thought he could waltz into my life and take everything I held dear. Sandra and I had been married for 10 years. Solid years, I thought. We built a life together. A house with a backyard she loved to garden in, 2 dogs she adored, and a marriage I believed was unshakable. But looking back, I see now that I was blind. Not naive, don't mistake me for that, but trusting. And trust is a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. It started small. The late nights at work, the sudden need for privacy on her phone, the shift in her demeanor. You know, the usual cliches. At first, I dismissed it. I mean, who wants to admit that their partner could be capable of deceit? It's easier to pretend nothing's wrong, to tell yourself that you're imagining things. But deep down, I knew. Sandra's affair wasn't a surprise. Not really. I'd pieced it together weeks before Victor, her lover, decided to barge into my life. Oh, he was careful, or so he thought. But when you've lived with someone for years, you pick up on the subtle changes. The way she'd smile at her phone, the careful deletion of certain messages, the unexplained absences. She thought she was being clever. She wasn't. I could have confronted her, could have screamed, cried, demanded answers. But that's not me. I don't do drama. I prefer precision. So, I waited. I watched. I collected the pieces of the puzzle until the picture was clear enough to see. And what I saw was Victor, tall, smug, arrogant. A man who believed he was invincible, untouchable. He wasn't just sleeping with my wife. He was mocking me in the process, laughing at the man he assumed was too weak to fight back. I'll admit, it stung. Knowing someone you've shared a life with could betray you is one thing. Realizing she chose a man like him is another. But I didn't let that sting turn into rash action. No, I let it fuel me. There's a difference, you see, between a man who reacts out of anger and a man who acts out of purpose. I wasn't interested in yelling matches or dramatic confrontations. I wanted resolution, my kind of resolution. And so, I prepared. Quietly, methodically, I began setting the stage for what I knew was coming. Because men like Victor don't stay in the shadows for long. They're peacocks, strutting and preening, desperate for attention. I knew he'd show himself sooner or later, and when he did, I'd be ready. Sandra was oblivious. Or maybe she wasn't. Maybe she saw the glint in my eye, the way I was calmer than usual, more detached. I think she assumed I didn't know, that I was too blind or too trusting to notice. It's funny, isn't it? How people mistake silence for weakness. They never stop to think that silence can be the sharpest weapon of all. And then, one rainy Thursday evening, it happened. I was in the living room, nursing a whiskey and watching the rain streak down the windows, when there was a knock at the door. Not Sandra's knock. No, hers was always light, hesitant, like she was afraid to disturb the air. This knock was bold, arrogant. Victor. I opened the door, and there he stood, 6'2", broad shoulders, that smug smile plastered across his face. He didn't even wait for an invitation. He pushed past me, dripping rain onto the hardwood floor, and made himself at home. The audacity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. That's when he started talking, mocking, gloating. And as I stood there, listening to him spew his bile, I realized something. This wasn't a man who'd won anything. He was a fool, and he'd just walked into the lion's den. You'd think that when a man barges into another man's house, uninvited, the first thing on his mind would be caution. Maybe a bit of respect for the space he's invading. But Victor? No, Victor was a different breed of fool. He strutted in like he owned the place. His shoes muddy, his jacket dripping rainwater onto my floor. For a moment, I stood there in silence, watching him. The audacity of this man wasn't infuriating. It was almost comical. "Nice place," he said, glancing around with a smirk, as if assessing his future kingdom. Though, I think Sandra mentioned wanting to change the curtains. Bit outdated, don't you think? Outdated. That's what he called the home I built with my own two hands, the space Sandra and I had filled with a decade of memories. But I didn't react. Not then. I let him continue his little performance. He walked into the living room, brushing past me like I was nothing more than a doorman. He didn't even bother to ask for permission to sit. He sank into my favorite armchair, my chair, and leaned back like he'd already claimed it. My fingers tightened around the glass of whiskey I was holding, but I didn't say a word. You know, he began, crossing one leg over the other. Sandra told me you were the quiet type. I guess she wasn't lying. Makes sense, though. Quiet men rarely keep their women happy. He let out a laugh, a low, mocking sound that echoed in the room. I didn't flinch. That's the thing about me. I'm not the kind of man you can rattle with cheap insults. Victor didn't understand that yet, but he would. She deserves better, don't you think? He continued, leaning forward now, his elbows resting on his knees. Someone who knows how to take care of her. Someone who isn't, well, you. He gestured toward me with a casual wave of his hand, like I was an afterthought. I didn't respond. I just stared at him, my face a mask of calm. That seemed to irritate him. Good. You're not going to say anything? He pressed, a hint of frustration creeping into his tone. Not going to fight for her? Beg me to leave her alone? Or are you really as weak as she says you are? Weak. He thought I was weak. It was almost laughable, but I let him believe it. I wanted him to believe it. Men like Victor thrive on the illusion of power, on the idea that they've already won. What he didn't realize was that he was playing a game I'd already mastered. Look, he said, leaning back again, his arrogance returning. I didn't come here to fight. I came here to give you a heads up. Sandra's leaving you. She's done with this quiet little life you've built. And frankly, I can't blame her. She deserves excitement, passion, things you clearly can't provide. He paused, waiting for a reaction. When he didn't get one, he chuckled, shaking his head. You're really something, you know that? Most men would have lost it by now. But not you. You're just standing there, staring at me like a damn statue. Do you even care that your wife is leaving you? I took a slow sip of my whiskey, letting the silence stretch. Finally, I set the glass down on the coffee table, the sound of it meeting the wood sharper than it should have been. It made Victor flinch, just slightly. I care, I said, my voice steady. I care enough to settle this. Like men. That caught his attention. His smirk returned, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Settle this? And how do you propose we do that? I gestured toward the basement door. We talk. Away from distractions. He hesitated, just for a moment. But Victor was too arrogant to let a little uncertainty stop him. He stood, brushing imaginary dust off his jacket, and grinned. Fine. Let's talk. Lead the way. And so I did. I led him to the basement, his footsteps heavy behind me. He thought he was walking into another moment of triumph, another opportunity to assert his so-called dominance. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the basement wasn't just a room in my house. It was my domain, and he had just stepped into a world where his arrogance meant nothing. As we descended into the basement, the air grew heavier, the faint scent of sawdust and old wood lingering in the space. Each step Victor took echoed louder than the last, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I walked ahead of him, calm and deliberate, my hand grazing the railing like a captain descending into the belly of his ship. Behind me, I could hear the shuffle of his expensive leather shoes on the steps, his confidence radiating off him in waves. This better not be a waste of my time, Victor grumbled, his tone laced with impatience. I've got plans tonight. I didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, I flicked on the basement light, the single bulb casting a dim, yellow glow over the room. It wasn't much to look at, just an ordinary basement to most eyes. A workbench to one side, cluttered with tools. A couple of shelves lined with paint cans, old boxes, and odds and ends. And in the middle of the room, a wooden table surrounded by two chairs. Simple, functional, purposeful. Victor stepped inside, his eyes darting around, trying to make sense of the setting. This is it? You're big, settling things like men. Plan involves a dingy basement? Could have at least cleaned up. I closed the door behind him, the soft click reverberating in the confined space. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did, but he was too full of himself to care. "Have a seat," I said, gesturing to one of the chairs. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to catch it. Despite all his bravado, a sliver of doubt had wormed its way into his mind. Good. He needed that doubt. It would keep him unbalanced. Victor shrugged and plopped into the chair, leaning back with his arms crossed. "All right, I'm here. So, what's this about? You gonna cry about how I stole your wife? Beg me to give her back? Maybe throw a punch and embarrass yourself even more?" I walked over to the workbench, my back to him, and picked up a bottle of whiskey I'd left there earlier. Slowly, I poured a glass, the liquid catching the light in a way that made it seem richer than it was. I took my time, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Finally, I turned around, glass in hand, and leaned against the workbench, meeting his gaze. "You think you've won, don't you?" He smirked, leaning forward now, as if he'd been waiting for me to speak. "I don't think. I know. Sandra's with me now, and there's nothing you can do about it. Hell, she's probably upstairs packing her bags while we're down here." I took a sip of the whiskey, savoring the burn as it slid down my throat. "Funny thing about people like you," I said, my tone calm and measured. "You're always so quick to assume you've got the upper hand. So eager to gloat before the game's even over." Victor's smirk faltered, just slightly. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "What are you getting at?" I set the glass down on the workbench with a soft clink, my gaze never leaving his. "You came into my house, sat in my chair, and talked about my wife like she's some prize you've won. But you didn't stop to think, did you? Didn't stop to ask yourself why I didn't kick you out the moment you walked in?" His confidence wavered then, just for a moment, like a crack forming in a polished facade. "Maybe because you're too scared to," he shot back, though the edge in his voice was thinner now. "Scared?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "No, Victor. I'm not scared. I'm patient. There's a difference." The room seemed to shrink around us, the dim light casting long shadows that danced on the walls. Victor shifted in his seat, the legs of the chair scraping against the floor. "All right, enough with the cryptic crap. If you've got something to say, say it." I took a step forward, slow and deliberate, the sound of my shoes against the concrete deliberate and steady. "What I'm saying, Victor, is that you walked into the wrong house. And you made the mistake of thinking this was about Sandra. It's not." His eyes widened, just slightly, as the weight of my words began to settle. I could see the gears turning in his head, the bravado he'd worn like armor starting to crack. He opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off. "You wanted to settle this like men," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, even tone. "So that's exactly what we're going to do." And with that, I gestured toward the table, my hand brushing over the edge of the chair opposite him. "Sit tight, Victor. This is where things get interesting." Victor sat there, his bravado flickering like a candle in the wind. The weight of the room pressed down on him, though he wouldn't admit it just yet. Men like him, they don't fold easily. They crack slowly, one layer of arrogance peeling away at a time. And I intended to peel back every last one. I took my seat opposite him at the small wooden table, the chair creaking slightly under my weight. Between us, the empty expanse of polished wood felt more like a battlefield than a piece of furniture. Victor leaned back, crossing his arms, trying to reclaim the dominance he thought he had. "So," he began, flashing that smug smile again, "what's the big plan? You gonna psychoanalyze me? Give me a lecture on morality? Or are we gonna arm wrestle for Sandra's heart?" He laughed at his own joke, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed in the basement. I let him laugh. I let him talk. That's the thing about men like Victor. They don't realize how much they reveal when they think they're in control. Every word he spat, every insult he hurled, it all told me more about him than he probably knew about himself. "No lectures," I said finally, my voice calm, measured. "And no games. I just think it's time we had an honest conversation." "Honest?" he scoffed, leaning forward now, his elbows resting on the table. "You want honesty? All right, here it is. Sandra doesn't love you anymore. She hasn't for a long time. She's with me now because I give her what you can't. Excitement, passion, fun. You know, things you probably haven't even heard of. His words were designed to sting, to provoke a reaction. But I gave him nothing. My face remained impassive, my hands resting loosely on the table. That unnerved him, though he tried to hide it. He expected me to yell, to slam my fists down, to lose control. But I don't play by anyone else's script. Interesting, I said, tilting my head slightly. And what makes you so sure she's with you for any of those reasons? Victor blinked, thrown off by the question. What? Excitement, passion, fun, I repeated. Do you really think that's what she's looking for? Or is that just what you're telling yourself to justify what you're doing? He frowned, the cracks in his confidence spreading just a little wider. I don't need to justify anything. She came to me. She made her choice. Did she? I asked, my voice soft but cutting. Or did you just happen to be there when she was at her lowest, whispering all the right things in her ear? Victor shifted in his chair, his posture stiffening. Look, I didn't come here for a therapy session. I don't need to explain myself to you. No, I agreed. You don't, but you should at least try to explain it to yourself. Because men like you always think you're winning until the moment you realize you've already lost. The tension in the room thickened, the silence stretching taut between us. Victor's smirk was gone now, replaced by a tight-lipped scowl. You're full of crap, you know that? I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest. Maybe. Or maybe I just know more about you than you'd like me to. He laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. You don't know anything about me, don't I? I asked, leaning forward slightly, my voice dropping to a whisper. I know you're not here because you care about Sandra. I know you're here because you needed to prove something. To her. To me. To yourself. And I know that underneath all that arrogance, you're just a scared little boy who's bitten off more than he can chew. Victor's fist slammed down on the table, the sudden noise jolting through the room. Enough, he snapped, his face flushed with anger. You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. I didn't flinch. Instead, I met his glare with a steady, unblinking gaze. You're right. I don't know you, but I know men like you. And trust me, Victor, this doesn't end the way you think it does. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. His jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists on the table. For the first time since he walked into my house, he looked unsure, vulnerable. I stood slowly, the chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back. Let's make one thing clear, I said, my voice calm but firm. You came here looking for a fight, but this isn't a fight you can win. So if you want to walk out of this house in one piece, I suggest you think very carefully about your next move. Victor stared at me, his chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. For a moment, I thought he might actually back down, but then his arrogance resurfaced, like a drowning man clawing for air. I'm not afraid of you, he spat. I smiled faintly, a flicker of amusement crossing my face. Good, I said, stepping toward the workbench. Because fear isn't what I'm after. And with that, the descent began in earnest. Victor sat rigidly at the table, the thin veneer of confidence he clung to peeling away with each passing second. His bravado had begun to falter, but he wasn't the kind of man to back down easily. That was fine. I didn't want him to back down. I wanted him to break. The basement, with its dim light and thick, suffocating air, felt like a stage. And on this stage, Victor thought he was the star, the hero who'd waltzed in to claim his prize. He couldn't see the trap closing around him. Not yet. So what now? Victor snapped, his voice sharp and defiant. You brought me down here to what? Intimidate me with some tough talk? Sorry, pal, but I've seen scarier faces than yours. I leaned against the workbench, my fingers grazing the cold steel of a wrench that rested there. I didn't pick it up. Not yet. Tools have a way of speaking for themselves, and their silent presence was enough for now. You talk a lot, Victor, I said, my tone calm, conversational even. That's your problem. Men who talk too much always give themselves away. Victor scoffed, leaning back in his chair in an attempt to regain his composure. And what have I given away, huh? That I'm not scared of you? That I'm the better man? Because that's not news, buddy. Better man? I echoed, raising an eyebrow. Interesting. Let's test that theory. I took a step closer, slow and deliberate, the floor creaking faintly under my weight. Victor's eyes flickered to the wrench, then back to me. For the first time, I saw a shadow of doubt creep into his expression. He hit it well, but not well enough. You see, Victor, I continued, stopping just short of the table, better men don't need to barge into another man's home to prove their worth. Better men don't need to gloat about stealing someone else's wife. Better men don't find themselves cornered in basements. Victor's jaw tightened. Cornered? Please. You think locking a door makes you the tough guy here? Newsflash. I could take you down in 10 seconds flat. I chuckled softly, shaking my head. That's the thing about you, Victor. You've spent your whole life relying on brute force, haven't you? Never stopping to think that strength isn't about muscle. It's about control. And right now, you've got none. Victor stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. You want control? He barked, his voice rising. Let's see how much control you've got when I wipe that smug look off your face. He lunged at me, his hands balled into fists, his movement fueled by anger and desperation. But I was ready. I sidestepped him easily, letting his momentum carry him past me. His shoulders slammed into the workbench, and he let out a grunt of frustration. Is that it? I asked, my tone almost mocking. The big, bad Victor reduced to flailing around in a basement? Shut up, he growled, spinning around to face me. His face was red, his breaths coming in sharp, shallow bursts. You think you're better than me? Huh. You think you can scare me? I didn't answer. Words were wasted on men like him. Instead, I grabbed the chair he'd been sitting on and slid it toward him. Sit down, I said, my voice cold, commanding. We're not done yet. Victor hesitated, his pride warring with his growing uncertainty. But eventually, he sat, his movements stiff and jerky. He glared at me, his chest still heaving. You're insane, he muttered. Maybe, I said, returning to the workbench. This time, I picked up the wrench, its weight solid and reassuring in my hand. Victor's eyes locked onto it, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Is that supposed to scare me? He asked, trying to sound defiant but failing miserably. No, I replied, turning the wrench over in my hands, inspecting it like it was the most fascinating object in the world. It's not about scaring you. It's about making you understand. Understand what? He spat. That you don't walk into a man's house, mock him, and expect to leave unscathed. Victor's fists clenched on the table, his knuckles turning white. You think you're going to beat me with a wrench? Go ahead, try it. See how far you get. I stepped forward, the wrench still in my hand, and leaned in close, so close I could see the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. This isn't about the wrench, Victor, I whispered. This is about teaching you a lesson. And trust me, by the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd never set foot in this house. For the first time, Victor didn't have a response. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged. And in that silence, I saw it, the flicker of fear in his eyes. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The cracks in his armor had finally begun to widen. The showdown had begun, and Victor was starting to realize he wasn't the hero of this story. He was the fool who'd walked into a trap of his own making. Victor's hand slammed the table, rattling the empty glass that still sat between us. I knew this was the moment he would break. The tension had been building with every passing second, his arrogance dissolving into raw, unchecked anger. He thought he could bully his way through this, that brute force would somehow give him the upper hand. He was wrong. You think you're tough? He snarled, shoving his chair back with a screech. You think you can stand there with your little smug act and intimidate me? Let me tell you something, old man. I've dealt with guys like you before. Pathetic, weak little men trying to act like they matter. I watched him rise, his fists clenched, his breathing sharp and shallow. He was trying to goad me into action, to provoke a reaction he could use. But I didn't move. Not yet. Let him burn out his rage first. You don't scare me, Victor continued, stepping closer. You're nothing. You couldn't keep your wife happy, and now you think throwing me in your creepy basement is going to change that? It's pathetic. I said nothing. My silence enraged him further. He reached for the edge of the table, gripping it tightly, and leaned forward. Say something, he roared. Or are you too much of a coward to even defend yourself? Slowly, deliberately, I set down the wrench I had been holding, letting the metallic clink reverberate in the room. I leaned forward, mirroring his stance, and locked eyes with him. You came here looking for a fight, I said, my voice calm but firm. Now you've got one. That was all the invitation he needed. With a guttural growl, Victor lunged at me, his fists swinging wildly. He was fast, I'll give him that, but not fast enough. I sidestepped his first punch, letting his momentum carry him into the workbench. He crashed into it with a grunt, tools clattering to the floor around him. He turned quickly, his face twisted in rage, and swung again. This time, I caught his arm mid-swing, twisting it sharply. He let out a shout of pain and dropped to one knee, but he wasn't done. With his free hand, he grabbed a hammer from the workbench and swung it at my side. The blow caught me off guard, pain shooting through my ribs. I staggered back, my grip on his arm loosening. He took advantage of the moment, shoving me hard against the wall. How's that feel, huh? He sneered, his confidence surging. Not so tough now, are you? I didn't respond. Instead, I pushed off the wall and charged at him, slamming my shoulder into his chest. We both hit the floor hard, the air knocked from his lungs in a sharp gasp. Before he could recover, I grabbed the hammer from his hand and tossed it across the room. Victor scrambled to his feet, his movements wild and desperate now. He grabbed a broken piece of the chair he had knocked over earlier, wielding it like a club. Come on, then, he shouted, his voice cracking. Let's finish this. I advanced slowly, my eyes locked on his. You think this is a fight you can win? I asked, my tone steady. You don't even know what you're up against. He swung the chair leg at me, but I caught it mid-air, wrenching it from his grip. The force of my move sent him stumbling backward, his arms flailing as he struggled to regain balance. I didn't give him the chance. I stepped forward and drove my fist into his gut, doubling him over. Victor collapsed onto the floor, clutching his stomach and gasping for air. He tried to crawl away, but I grabbed his ankle, dragging him back toward the center of the room. No more running, I said coldly. We're finishing this right here. He rolled onto his back, his face pale and sweaty, his bravado completely shattered. All right, he panted, raising his hands in surrender. You win. Just let me go. I stood over him, my chest heaving, my fists clenched. For a moment, I considered ending it here and now, finishing what he had started. But then I saw the fear in his eyes, the realization that he wasn't the predator he thought he was. He was prey. You don't deserve to walk out of here, I said, my voice low and measured. But I'm not going to stoop to your level. Victor blinked up at me, his confusion mingling with relief. What does that mean? It means you're going to leave this house, I said, stepping back and pointing to the stairs. And you're never coming back. If I see you again, anywhere, it won't end like this. Victor nodded quickly, too scared to argue. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his side, and staggered toward the stairs. He paused at the door, looking back at me one last time. You're insane, he muttered, his voice shaking. Maybe, I replied, picking up the wrench from the floor. But at least I'm still standing. Victor didn't say another word. He bolted up the stairs, leaving the basement and the battle behind. The door at the top of the basement stairs slammed shut with a hollow echo. For the first time in what felt like hours, silence enveloped the room. It wasn't the kind of silence that calms you. No, this was a weighted silence, thick with everything that had just unfolded. Victor was gone, but the storm he'd brought with him still lingered. I stood in the middle of the basement, my chest rising and falling as I tried to steady my breathing. My hands were still clenched, the tension in my knuckles refusing to fade. The wrench lay on the floor where I had dropped it, its metallic sheen dull under the dim light. For a long moment, I stared at it, my thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess. This wasn't just about Victor, was it? Sure, he'd been the immediate catalyst, the fool who thought he could saunter into my life and upend it. But the truth was, the cracks in my world had started long before he arrived. Victor was just the spark. The fire had been building for months, years even. I walked over to the table and sat down heavily, the wood groaning under my weight. My ribs ached where his hammer had connected, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the churning inside me. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and let my head fall into my hands. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was gone now, leaving behind exhaustion and something else, something darker. I thought back to Sandra, to the life we'd built, the promises we'd made. How had it come to this? Was it my fault? Had I been too distant, too focused on other things? Or was she simply the kind of person who could never be satisfied, no matter what I did? The questions circled endlessly, each one more bitter than the last. But then, an unsettling realization crept in. Victor's intrusion, his arrogance, his insults, they had ignited something in me, something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just anger or betrayal. It was power. For the first time in a long time, I'd felt in control. I dictated the terms, set the stage, and watched as Victor unraveled under my gaze. And now, as I sat in the aftermath, I couldn't decide if that scared me or thrilled me. The sound of dripping water pulled me from my thoughts. Somewhere in the corner, a leaky pipe tapped out a rhythmic beat. I stared at the damp spot on the concrete floor, my mind drifting to what could have been. If I'd let my anger take over completely, if I'd swung the wrench one more time, would I feel better, or would I feel worse? I pushed the thought aside and stood, my movements slow and deliberate. The basement felt different now, less like a part of my home and more like a battlefield, a place where something primal had been unearthed. I walked over to the workbench and began tidying up, placing tools back in their proper places, wiping away the smudges Victor had left behind. It was a small act of control, a way to ground myself. But as I worked, I couldn't ignore the nagging question. What happens next? Victor was gone, but Sandra wasn't. Upstairs, in the home we once shared, she was likely waiting. What would she say when she saw the bruises forming on my ribs, the cuts on my knuckles? Would she even care? Or would she brush it off, just as she had brushed off everything else? I finished cleaning up and turned toward the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of what awaited me pressing down with relentless force. When I reached the top, I paused, my hand resting on the doorknob. I could hear faint sounds on the other side. Her footsteps, the soft clink of dishes in the sink. She was going about her evening as if nothing had happened, as if the man she'd been seeing hadn't just walked out of our home, beaten and humiliated. I pushed the door open, stepping into the light of the kitchen. Sandra turned, her expression neutral, almost bored. She opened her mouth to speak, but I raised a hand, stopping her. "Don't," I said, my voice low and firm. "Not yet." For the first time in years, she hesitated. She closed her mouth and watched me, her eyes flicking to the marks on my body. I could see the questions forming in her mind, the flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. It was the same uncertainty I'd seen in Victor's eyes down in the basement, and it gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. "I'll tell you what happened," I continued, "but first, you need to decide something. Are you going to keep lying to me, or are we finally going to have the truth?" Sandra's lips parted, but no sound came, the weight of the moment pressing against my chest like a leaden hand. Sandra didn't say a word. She just stared, her gaze shifting from the bruises on my ribs to the faint smear of blood on my knuckles. Her eyes were wide, but not with concern. No, what I saw in her expression was something else entirely. Fear mixed with guilt and just a flicker of defiance. The silence stretched between us like a taut rope, and for a brief moment, I wondered if she tried to spin some lie, to feign innocence or turn the blame on me. But she didn't. Instead, she folded her arms and leaned against the counter, her lips pressed into a tight line. It was a stance I knew well, Sandra's way of pretending she wasn't rattled, even when the cracks in her composure were plain as day. Victor's gone, I said finally, my voice low but firm. He won't be coming back. She flinched at his name, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting him to burst through it again. When nothing happened, she looked back at me, her expression hardening. "What did you do?" she asked, her tone sharp and accusing. I tilted my head, a faint, humorless smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "What did I do? That's your first question?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly unsure how to proceed. I took a step closer, and she instinctively backed up, her hands gripping the edge of the counter behind her. It wasn't fear of physical harm. I'd never laid a hand on her in anger, and she knew I never would. No, this was something deeper. She was afraid of what I'd become. "What I did," I said, my voice calm but cold, "was show him exactly what happens when you cross a line you can't uncross. He walked out of here alive, Sandra, but not because he deserved to." She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. "I didn't ask him to come here," she said finally, her voice defensive. "I didn't know he was going to." "Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't insult me by pretending you didn't have a part in this. He came here because he thought he had already won. Because you let him believe that. Do you even realize what kind of man you invited into our lives?" She looked away, her jaw tightening. For a moment, I thought she might try to deny it, but then she let out a sharp breath and said, "I didn't mean for it to get this far." "That's your excuse?" I asked, my tone cutting. "You didn't mean for it to get this far? What did you mean to happen, Sandra? Were you hoping I'd just sit here quietly while you played house with him?" Her shoulders sagged, and she shook her head, her voice trembling now. "I don't know, okay? I don't know what I was thinking. I needed something different. Something more." "More," I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. "You needed more. And instead of coming to me, talking to me, you chose him." She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "I made a mistake," she whispered. "I know that now. But you," she paused, gesturing toward me. "You're different. You've changed." I let out a low, humorless laugh. "You think I've changed? Maybe I have. Or maybe this is who I've always been. Maybe you just never bothered to see it." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, oppressive, and I could feel the weight of everything we'd lost pressing down on both of us. Finally, she broke the silence. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. I turned away, running a hand through my hair as I considered her question. What had happened now? Could we rebuild what we'd lost? Did I even want to? The answers didn't come easily, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the sting of doubt. "You need to leave," I said finally, my voice firm but quiet. "Take whatever you need and go. I need time, space, and you need to figure out who you are without dragging me down with you." Her breath hitched, and I could hear the faint shuffle of her feet as she moved toward the stairs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of her footsteps ascending was the only proof I had that she'd listened. The days that followed were strange, quiet. The house felt hollow without her, and though part of me welcomed the silence, another part mourned the life we'd built. I threw myself into work, into fixing the things around the house that had fallen into disrepair over the years. It was easier than facing the emptiness. Victor didn't show up again. I doubted he ever would. Men like him were cowards at heart, quick to run when faced with real consequences. As for Sandra, she called a few times, leaving voicemails I couldn't bring myself to listen to. I didn't need her apologies, her explanations. I needed clarity, and I wouldn't find it in her words. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood in the backyard, watching the light fade. The future was uncertain, and for the first time, I was okay with that. I wasn't the same man I'd been before Victor barged into my life, but maybe that was a good thing. Sometimes, losing everything isn't the end. Sometimes, it's the beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to begin again. Alone, but stronger.